A common question that comes up is, how can I go about accepting investment from non-accredited investors? And can I even do that in a startup? I'll answer that question in today's video. Hi, I'm Steve Morris, and I use this Startup SOS channel to provide practical how-to advice for first-time entrepreneurs. So sometimes you simply need funding from investors to get started in your startup. And sometimes the only people you have access to who are interested in investing, at least early on, are people who don't qualify as accredited investors. Now, we talked about what an accredited investor is in the previous video on SEC exemptions. If you haven't checked that out, I suggest you take a look at that first, because that also talks about some exemptions that are going to come back into play again in today's video. One more bit of housekeeping. This is, of course, not legal advice. This is educational material to help you ask the right questions when you go get legal advice. But I always strongly urge entrepreneurs to talk to an emerging business attorney, someone who's familiar with SEC laws and regulations, before you accept any kind of investment in your startup. So the good news is, yes, non-accredited investors can invest in your startup. But the trick is, you need to follow an SEC exemption that allows that. Now, we again talked about SEC exemptions in the last video. Basically, you need to have an SEC exemption to avoid the alternative, which is doing a full-blown registration of your offering for investors to your startup. Full-blown registration is kind of the default situation with the SEC, and it's simply too expensive and complicated for an early-stage startup to tackle. So you have to raise money under an SEC exemption. The question becomes, which exemptions allow you to raise money from non-accredited investors? And the good news is, there are a few. Before we run down the list, 3 considerations you should think about. One is to think about, really, how many investors do you plan to get? The challenge with non-accredited investors who are probably putting in a relatively small amount of money is that to hit your investment goal, you might have to have a lot of investors. Well, if you have 30 or 40 or 50 investors in your company, that's a lot of people to manage, because investors do need some management, some communication. So that's a good thing to think about, is really, how many investors are you prepared to manage? A related question is, what are the expectations that those investors have? Kind of by definition, the SEC thinks that a non-accredited investor is not terribly sophisticated when it comes to investing in startups. Well, that means they may have unrealistic expectations on, say, how much access they should have to the management team, or how much input they should have in strategic decisions inside the company. It's important to set those expectations clearly as you approach non-accredited investors, so they don't come up with the wrong idea and you don't end up with 40 or 50 people thinking that they should have input to every decision that the company is making. A final thing to think about is, if down the road you expect to raise money from angel investors or venture capital, VC investors, then it's important to understand that a lot of angel and venture capital investors get nervous when they look at a company that has a lot of non-accredited investors, because they look at those as being relatively unsophisticated people who might not really understand what's reasonable and what's not reasonable in how a company works with investors. And there's risk there. There's liability potential there. It can result in lawsuits that can really defocus the company and be a real hassle. So it's good to keep that in mind if you're going to raise money down the road, you believe, from angels or VCs. You need to be a little bit careful about raising money from a lot of non-accredited investors. There are strategies to help with all of these issues. For example, you can collect together all of your non-accredited investors into an LLC that has one manager, and that one manager is the one person that's actually communicating with and dealing with the company. As you can imagine, that greatly simplifies your communication life. It tends to make angels and VCs a little bit more comfortable. But it is something that you have to set up proactively ahead of time as you're bringing those investors on board. So it's good to explore with an emerging business attorney strategies like that for kind of managing this group of non-accredited investors. So it's a good thing to look into before you move ahead with your fundraising. And again, another reason to talk to an emerging business attorney. So the good news is there are multiple exemptions the SEC provides that can allow you to accept funding from non-accredited investors. 3 of these we actually covered in the previous video, but there's a 4th that we need to add to the list if your focus is specifically on non-accredited investors. So I'll run through the first 3 quickly, and then we'll spend a little more time on option number 4. But quickly, the list is, first of all, there's under, as you might recall from the earlier video, under Regulation D, there's Rule 504 and 506B, both of which allow non-accredited investors. And of course, there's Regulation Crowdfunding, which also allows that. The other category is Rule 147 and 147A. These are intra-state funding exemptions. So specifically, if you're raising money from investors who live just in one state, specifically the state in which you primarily do business, then this exemption can be another way to raise money from non-accredited investors. Okay, let's start at the top of the list. So under this umbrella of Regulation D, one of the options is Rule 504. It does allow you to raise money from non-accredited as well as accredited investors, and there's no SEC disclosures required. Of course, the state may require disclosures, and to get investment, you'll always have to disclose a certain amount of information to your investors. The other Regulation D offering or rule that allows you to raise money from accredited and non-accredited is 506B. Now, it's primarily focused on accredited investors. This is the rule that most startups use to raise money from angels, but it does allow you to raise money from up to 35 non-accredited investors. So there is a cap on the number. Normally, there are no disclosure requirements if everyone who invests is an accredited investor. But we're talking here about non-accredited. In the case of non-accredited, in order to protect yourself, you do have to do a lot of disclosures if you use a 506B exemption, because you need to make sure that these non-accredited investors who are assumed to not be sophisticated, you need to make sure that they're aware of all of the significant risks involved in investing in your company. That means a lot more lawyer time to document what all the risks are, and so your costs go up. You'll spend more on attorney fees. So that's the big limitation, I think, of using this particular exemption if your real focus is on non-accredited investors. On the other hand, this exemption does give you an exemption from state blue sky laws. In other words, you don't have to worry about the different requirements for a registration in different states. And you can raise an unlimited amount. And that brings us to Regulation Crowdfunding. So requirements to qualify for that exemption: number 1, your solicitation and actual sale of your security cannot be done by you. It has to be done through an independent third party that's registered specifically for doing this type of transaction. There are some disclosure requirements when you do the crowdfunding. Again, we talked more about this in the last video. You do have to submit a notification to the SEC, a Form C, as it's called, and there is a cap, which is $5 million. So those are the 3 approaches that we covered in the previous video. Now let's talk about 147 and 147A. So both Rule 147 and 147A are intra-state exemptions. In other words, these apply if the investors you're accepting money from reside in your state, where your state means the principal place where you're doing business, that state. If you're willing to limit yourself to one state, then the SEC is essentially saying, we'll put very few constraints on you will defer primarily to the state requirements for registering and actually doing an offering in that particular state. Under the Rule 147, you cannot offer the investment to anybody outside of the state. So not only must you accept money only from people that are residents of the state, you can't even offer or you can't really do a public disclosure, because that would be making an offer to people outside of the state. So each state that supports this exemption, and there are about roughly 35 states, I believe, that provide an exemption under this Rule 147. They'll define exactly how you can proceed with making the offering. One way or another, you'll have to verify that somebody is a resident of your state before you can solicit them to invest in your startup. And again, the rules are different for each state. Now, by definition, for this exemption, you're not exempt from the state-specific blue sky laws. In fact, specifically, you have to follow the guidelines set by your state within this exemption to raise money from residents of your state. What are the benefits? Why might you go down this route? Well, number one, the federal government doesn't put any restriction on the number of investors you can have or on the amount that you can raise. And there's not even an SEC filing requirement as long as you meet the requirements of this exemption. That's a lot of flexibility from the SEC side. However, your state can have plenty of regulatory limitations. It can limit how much you can raise in total. It can limit how much you can raise from any individual person. It can limit how many investors you might have. It can absolutely specify disclosures that you need to make to each of those investors. And of course, each state tends to be different in what the requirements are that they have. So your challenge is to investigate, first of all, does your state offer a program that takes advantage of the 147 exemption? And number two, if so, what exactly are the rules that you have to operate within that are defined by the state? Now, closely related to Rule 147 is 147A. That was a bit of an update to 147 that primarily added one bit of flexibility. If the state is operating under a 147A exemption, then you're still limited to investors only being from that particular state. But it's okay if there are other people from outside the state that actually see your offer. So you can be a little more flexible in terms of getting the word out there, as long as you only take investment from people who are residents of your state. By definition, there's no blue sky exemption here, because what the SEC is saying is stick to that state and you got to follow the rules set by that particular state. So here we have the same benefits that you had with the Rule 147, unlimited number of investors, no limit on the amount you can raise, no SEC filing requirement. And again, as I mentioned, you can be a little more flexible in being more public about your offering, because it's okay if people outside of your state hear about it. So those are the options that are available to you to raise money from non-accredited investors. And the question is now to look at the different trade-offs from each approach and figure out which one might best fit the fundraising goal that you have. You can certainly use a Reg D exemption to raise money from non-accredited investors. The trick is, as shown in the highlight here, there's no blue sky exemption. So in other words, you have to follow the rules in the states where you're raising money. Of course, the more states you're raising money from, the more complicated that will get. The federal government is simply saying, oh yeah, there's a $5 million cap on your overall fundraising. Looking at Reg D 506B, you can take investment from up to 35 non-accredited investors. But yes, you are going to have to do some pretty significant disclosures to make sure that they understand the risk involved. Rule 147, on the one hand, you have some constraints on the public solicitation because you can only solicit from people who you've confirmed are indeed residents of the state. And And again, by definition, you're not exempt from the blue sky laws because it's primarily the state that will set the rules. So that's where you have to do your research. And by comparison, the advantage of 147A, if that's the exemption that your state is operating under in their program, is you can be a little more flexible in terms of public solicitation as long as you're only accepting investment from people who reside in your state. And then finally, there's Regulation Crowdfunding, which, again, at least it is public, allows non-accredited. Perhaps the major drawback, which is also maybe an advantage, is that you're working with a third party. So on the one hand, you have to pay them and depend on them to do the solicitation and the sale. On the other hand, hopefully they're experts in that, and they should be able to help you market your investment round and help you reach your investment goal. So those are the most common ways that you can fund your startup from non-accredited investors. It definitely can be done, but keep in mind the considerations we talked about early on, things that you'll want to think about before you leap into this. And of course, as I suggested earlier, please talk to an attorney that understands SEC law, that's an emerging business attorney, and can help you raise money and stay legal at the same time. Always an important consideration. If this was helpful, please click the like button and share it with other entrepreneurs that might benefit. If you have any comments or questions, please leave a comment. And if you haven't subscribed yet, of course, please do that and click that notification bell because there's more coming up in this series on funding your company. And of course, there's a link to a playlist right below me where we'll keep adding links to the videos in this series. That's a wrap for this discussion of funding your company from non-accredited investors. Thank you very much for watching.